Hey guys, it's me, your host of Dharma Drops podcast, Rebecca Warfield, and I'm just living that motherfucking Bucci life. Okay, because let me tell you, I have been fermenting anything that I can find in my house right now, including making pickles. I have pickled jalapenos, pickled red onions. I did pickled eggs. I'm about to do some pickled plantains and green avocados, all sorts of stuff. But one thing I've been fermenting is tea because I've been making kombucha, and I just opened my first bottle of kombucha after the second fermentation. I'm drinking a peach pomegranate kombucha, and it is so good. I can't get over it. Oh, and you know what else I've been doing? I almost forgot to tell you. I've also been making my own aged cashew brie. It is getting crazy around here because we're still stuck in quarantine. And what else are you going to do in the middle of a pandemic? You just got to pickle some shit. That's it. That's all we can do. In any case, for those of you just tuning in for the first time, hey, what's up? I'm Rebecca Warfield, and this is Dharma Drops podcast, the mini episode for Wednesday, May 13th. I do want to apologize if I'm talking like really loudly. So I have what's called Meniere's disease, and it doesn't act up all the time, but it is acting up right now. And essentially what that is an inner ear disorder. And it sounds like there's a helicopter landing in my right ear. It is maddening. They say that that might be why Van Gogh cut his ear off. And I don't have any plans to cut my ear off, but it is really frustrating. So hopefully by the next time we're together, it will be gone. I'm going to acupuncture today with Pam, who you probably know from a few episodes ago. Pam Butt, she's an acupuncturist here in Wilmington. So hopefully we'll be able to get this under control. But in any case, welcome back. It is Wednesday and we are here with the mini drop, which means first, just a few updates about things that are happening around Dharma Drops. The Dharma Drops Yoga on Demand site is growing. I'm really excited about it. So if you go to dharmadropspodcast.com and you hover over virtual yoga, you'll see Dharma Drops Yoga on Demand. And I've just reformatted that whole page. And on that page, there's actually a free 1-hour class. It's a balancing practice for spring. So you can check that out. It's a YouTube video. It's right there, easy for you to use. But there's also a little more information about what's happening on the virtual studio, sort of the mission of the studio, and what's going on, including your 7-day free trial. So you can head over to dharmadropspodcast.com and check that out. And you've probably already seen the new campaign for the Dharma Drops the on-demand studio. It's called Yoga Without Bullshit, because that's basically what Dharma Drops is. And as I mentioned on the site, around Dharma Drops, we deeply respect the practice of yoga and believe that it can transform our lives, but we don't do dogma and we don't value one practice over another. And so on the virtual on-demand site, it's really an opportunity to practice yoga in your way, dropping all the bullshit and just getting into the yoga practice. So again, you can check that out on dharmadropspodcast.com. In terms of other things happening around Dharma Drops, last week was Mother's Day. So we had a full week of Mother's Day blog posts, and they're amazing. So it's not just posts for moms. There are some posts for mamas who gave birth to human babies. There's also a lot of information on the blog about honoring the mother goddess within, some yoga poses that honor maternal energy within all of us, male or female. So you can access that on the blog. And in terms of the shop, look, y'all have been clearing me out of yoga props. So thank you, first of all. And I really appreciate that you are taking the time to shop on Dharma Drops and supporting Dharma Drops. And I'm even more excited that you're taking the time to support your yoga practice. So I'm really excited about that. I did have to pull some stuff off the site because they are sold out, but I have replaced it with some new stuff. So you can check all of that out at dharmadropspodcast.com. I almost said dharmadropspodcast.com. You can check it out there and see all the new stuff. And there's some new stuff coming on the way. I can't quite say what it is just yet because things haven't been finalized. However, I am expecting some new pretty awesome stuff to be in the shop real soon, y'all. So cheers to that. Let's take a sip of kombucha. It's good. So I am trying to keep the mini drop at a more reasonable length. So let's get right into it. So what I want to talk about today in the mini drop episode is I want to share with you a few of my favorite books that inspire my yoga practice. So I've read a ton of yoga books. I'm sure a lot of you listening have read a ton of yoga books. And, not every yoga book is the same. And I really love philosophy, and I really love sort of giving in to that headspace sometimes about yoga and yoga philosophy. But I picked books today that are really accessible and that can help us think about really how to transform our practice or elevate our practice with a little bit of deeper knowledge about what we're doing on the yoga mat. So maybe we'll save all the sort of not that these are not intellectual books, but sort of the headspace books for another episode. These books are really accessible, and I really think that a yogi at any level, whether it's your first day on the yoga mat or your 11th lifetime on the yoga mat, these books can really help us support our practice in a really accessible and tangible way. So with that said, I have picked 4 books, and I am not going through them in any particular order. I just grabbed the 4 books that I wanted to talk about and threw them in a pile on my desk, and that's the order that we're going to go in. So to start, I'd like to talk about myths of the asanas, the stories at the heart of the yoga tradition. And this is by, and I'm really, really sorry to the authors of this if I butcher your name, but this is by Alana Kaivalya and Arjuna Vanderkuji. I'm sorry about the last one. I'm pretty confident about the Arjuna Vander. It's the Kooj that I'm a little concerned I butchered. And this is a really beautiful book. It has lovely illustrations, and it shares the stories of the main sort of families of asana, and in some cases particular postures in the yoga practice. So just to share with you the content. So for example, it covers the poses of the yogi, Padmasana, Anjali, and Namaste Mudras, Chakrasana. Look, Chakrasana, let's just talk about that one for 1 second. That is not my go-to posture. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Trikonasana, Siddhasana, Dhanurasana, and so on. Then the next section is poses of the gods, and then there's poses of the sages, animals, and earth, and an afterword, and also a foreword. So there's a foreword by Shiva Ray and an afterword by Manorama, who I love Manorama. If you've listened to this podcast before, you've definitely heard me talk about Manorama. But this is one of my favorite yoga books because what it does is it shares the mythological stories of the yoga practice. And when we know a little bit more about the mythology of yoga or about the traditions of the yoga practice, then our practice actually takes a little more depth. So we're not just standing in a warrior pose, like with our front quadricep on fire and not sure why the hell we're doing this, where when we know the story, what we're really doing is channeling the energy of that story, channeling the intention of the story, which brings a whole new level to the yoga practice. So I really like to read this book. Actually, I often read it to my classes if I'm focusing on a particular posture. If the story is in the book, I'll read it to my classes. But sometimes if I just need to get back in check with what the intention of the posture is, I like to turn to this book. And I have read Hanumanasana and Matsyendrasana probably 100 times out of this book. It's those 2 stories are my all-time favorite from the book. But in any case, it's a really great way to bring a little depth to your yoga practice. And the stories or the tellings or the retellings of the stories are really accessible. Because, sometimes if you look up mythology online or something, it can get so complicated, especially if you weren't born into that particular culture and these aren't stories that you've been hearing your whole life. It can feel really complicated. So these stories are really easy to understand. They're very accessible and entertaining too. I will say my one complaint about the book, and I don't even really know if it's a complaint. I shouldn't even say that. It's more of just my own response to the book, I guess, is that sometimes it feels, in terms of the spiritual approach, a little bit out of touch for my life. So there's a lot of conversation about God. And when I say a religious approach, I don't actually mean a religious approach. I'm just I don't even have the right word for it right now. But when yoga talks about things like God, sometimes I start to retract because that language doesn't work for me. And so that language is embedded and ingrained into this book, and the sentiments of that are in the book too. And so if you are like me and maybe that doesn't resonate with you that that well, you can just replace that word with whatever works for you. So just a little heads up about that. I know that that sort of approach doesn't work for every yogi, particularly those who might be new to the practice. When I first started practicing yoga, I was really turned off by that sort of language. And even though I don't really connect with it now, I'm pretty good now about just replacing it with what works for me, what I understand what's happening there, and then moving on. So just a little heads up about that. So that's Myths of the Asanas. I really, really recommend this book. If you are practicing asana, I really recommend checking this book out. Oh, and one thing that I forgot to mention, I should have even shared this with you before I started running my mouth about books, is that all the links for these books will be in the show notes page. I'll take you right to Amazon and you can get them there. So if you want to get them, if you want to learn more about them, you can check them out just by going to the show notes page at dharmadropspodcast.com. But in any case, so that's Myths of the Asanas. And obviously I'm doing a pretty quick overview of these books here because, well, I can't talk about them all day. Technically, I could talk about them all day, but I don't think you want me to. So another book that I really like is called Mudras, Yoga in Your Hands. And this is by Gertrude, I think it's Hershey. I'm sorry. I'm like butchering everyone's names. I don't mean to. I'm trying. You're welcome to tell me how to pronounce it because I would like to pronounce it correctly. But it's Hirschchi. So this is a book of mudras that you can incorporate into your yoga practice or your meditation practice. And I have to be honest, I actually really love mudras, but I often forget about them. And so what I like about this book is sort of like Myths of the Asanas, it brings in a new layer of practice. Whereas Myths of the Asanas maybe brings in a layer of practice of understanding the energetic intention of the actual asana itself. The mudra differs in that it's an additional energetic practice, if that makes sense. So it's not just an understanding of where the posture came from, it's an addition to the practice that you're already doing. So maybe instead of me trying to tell you about this, how about I just read you an excerpt from the book, which might give you better insight about what a mudra is, because please, I don't know what I'm talking about. So this is directly from Mudras, Yoga in Your Hands. Mudra is a term with many meanings. It is used to signify a gesture, a mystic position of the hands, a seal, or even a symbol. However, there are eye positions, body postures, and breathing techniques that are called mudras. These symbolic finger, eye, and body postures can vividly depict certain states or processes of consciousness. Conversely, specific positions can also lead to the states of consciousness that they symbolize. What does this mean in concrete terms? For example, a person who frequently and fervently does the gesture of fearlessness, which can often be seen in the depiction of Indian deities, will also be freed from fearlessness with time. So mudras engage certain areas of the brain and or soul and exercise a corresponding influence on them. However, mudras are also effective on the physical level. And then she continues on from there to talk a little bit more about mudras. But if you want to learn more, you can check out her book on Amazon and purchase it and read it. But what I like about this is that for me, sometimes when my practice starts to get stale, it isn't that I need a new challenge posture to work on. It isn't that I need to work harder in my yoga practice. Usually what's missing is the intention or the energetic intention. And a mudra is a really nice way to add that into the practice and to sort of step your practice up a level into a whole new energetic form. Well, I've been working a lot actually since the coronavirus pandemic began with Abhaya Mudra. And I may have mentioned this on the podcast before. I actually can't remember if I have. I know I told someone, I just can't remember if it was you. But I've been working a lot with Abhaya Mudra, and I don't know if I fully believe that these mudras actually seal in this new understanding of consciousness, but for me, they definitely set an intention, and it makes that intention more clear, and I'm more able to carry that through my yoga practice, and then it seems a little more readily available off my yoga mat. And hey, I don't know. Look, I don't have all the answers here. Maybe that actually is sealing in that consciousness. The fact that it works for me, maybe it is a new level of consciousness that I have received. But for me, the way I like to think about it is a way of setting intention. But in any case, in terms of this book, it has a lot of information. So it has information about what are mudras, the origin of mudras, breathing, visualization, and affirmations to enhance mudras, mudras in music, mudras in color. The more I say mudra, the stranger that word is sounding. Mudra. And then there's information about mudras for healing, physical complaints, emotional problems, and so on. In terms of hand mudras, there's 52 of them in here. So, I mean, that's a lot of information and some pretty cool stuff for you to experiment with in your practice. And like all the books that I've picked today, this is really accessible. The illustrations of the mudra are clear. It's not complicated. It's actually not even photographs. It's just very simple hand illustrations. And each mudra has about a page to a page and a half or so of information, affirmations, and beyond that helps support the practice of that mudra. So again, this book is called Mudras, Yoga in Your Hands. Okay, on to book 3. So many of you have probably read this book. This is sort of one of the quintessential yoga books out there. I feel like, in fact, now that I'm thinking about this, this was the first yoga book I ever bought. Living Your Loga. I feel like that was like Living La Vida Loca. Living Your Yoga, Finding the Spiritual in Everyday Life. And this is by Judith Lasater. And she's fantastic. I think a lot of us have probably had some experience with Judith Lasater. If not, run to the internet and get this book now. But Living Your Yoga, I think this was actually the first book I ever bought that was about yoga. And I was working at a yoga studio that's no longer open called Harmony Yoga in Wilmington. I was actually doing work trade. I was checking people at the front desk for free yoga. But one of the teachers there was actually reading from this book, and I really felt inspired from it. So I bought a copy of it and I started to read it and I hated it. I was like, this is the dumbest shit I've ever read. I don't understand anything that she's talking about. And I put the book to the side, and then I actually didn't practice yoga for a while. And then when I finally came back to the yoga practice and started practicing on the reg, I came back to this book, and it made so much sense. I just wasn't ready for it the first time I read it. But what I really like about this book is that it talks about how, just like it says, living your yoga. How can we live our yoga practice off the mat? And if we're talking about elevating our yoga practice, that's really the work that we're doing. It's kind of like what I said about the mudras, actually. You do the mudra in your yoga practice, and then you feel its energetic quality later in your life. It's that reminder of that energy. And living your yoga is sort of like that. It's a reminder of how these practices and how the teachings play out in our regular lives. And, you know, I was hardly ready for yoga on a mat when I first bought this book. I definitely wasn't ready to live yoga off my mat at that time. So it makes sense that I didn't connect with it. But, you know, this book is fan-freaking-tastic. I have recommended it to many people. My only complaint, and again, it's not a complaint, there's a lot of reference here to motherhood, and I'm not a mom. And so this is something that I struggle with as a woman in her late 30s anyway, is that, you know, so many things that we read are contextualized in family and motherhood, and that's not something that I have or that I have experienced. So sometimes I feel a little bit disconnected from the book. Of course, I have the intellectual capacity to like get it, you know, but if maybe you don't have children, or if you don't have that family unit connection that she's referencing, sometimes that might make the teachings of her work just feel a little bit disconnected. But outside of that, this book is so good. And, I have the old edition and the new edition. Both of them are so marked up and dog-eared and banged up because I've read it a million times. So just to give you an idea of what the book covers, part 1 is awakening awareness, yoga within yourself. Part 2 is widening the circle, yoga and relationships. And then part 3 is embracing all life, yoga in the world. So it's broken down into digestible chunks. And like a lot of yoga books, I don't know if it's a great idea to pick this book up and just read it from beginning to end. It's not a story. And like a lot of these sorts of books, you read a little bit, you take it in, you live your life, you incorporate what you've learned, then you come back to it. And you read another part, take it in, incorporate it, and then come back as you feel ready. So again, that is Living Your Yoga, Finding the Spiritual in Everyday Life. And now, last but not least, here we are. This is a really lovely book called Yoga at Home, and it is by Linda Sparrow. And this book, I picked this one actually because we've talked a lot on Dharma Drops the last few weeks, months, years, however long we've been dealing with the coronavirus, about really dropping into your home yoga practice because we're stuck at home. And what I like about this book is it shows how diverse the home yoga practice can be. And what I think is most inspiring is that it does that through what we might call, quote, celebrity yoga teachers, for lack of better terms. And I think that we have this misconception that like the real yogis and the real yoga teachers, they're only doing 2-hour yoga practices every day in their perfect home yoga studio with all of their really perfect things and perfect postures. And this book debunks all of that. And it does it by showing the home practice and the practice space of all these teachers that probably many of us know and admire and look up to. So there are a ton of teachers in here, but just to name a few that are featured: Sean Korn, Elena Bauer, Krishna Das, Rod Stryker, Rodney Yee and Colleen Sedman Yee, Jason Crandall, Annie Carpenter, who is a guest on Dharma Drops podcast. So these are yoga teachers that, are really world renowned, and it shows how diverse their yoga practice is. And I'd like to read an excerpt actually from Jason Crandall's section, because I love Jason Crandall's classes and I've taken a ton of his classes online and I really admire the things that he has to say. And on top of that, it actually contradicts some things that I have said about the home practice. I don't know if it was 1 episode ago, 2 episodes ago, I was talking about how the home yoga practice allows us to work on postures that we find challenging. And what I like is that he contradicts that. And that's good because all of it's true, right? No matter what we think about the home yoga practice, it's all true. But he says, don't feel that you need to work on poses that you struggle with. Teachers often tell students that they should spend more time practicing poses that are difficult for them. This may be true, but it's a terrible idea to focus on those poses when you're trying to establish a home practice. Instead, focus on poses that you love. And I think that's really good advice. And speaking of advice, each of these chapters for the teacher has sort of a little snapshot of the teacher's home yoga practice, a little bit of advice that the teacher has for the reader about the home yoga practice. And you can really see how diverse the home yoga practice can become. And on top of all that, it's just really beautifully put together too. So again, that is Yoga at Home, inspiration for creating your home yoga practice. Okay, just a really quick recap so you know what books I'm talking about. My gosh, they're all in my lap and falling off. Hold on here. Let me put all my shit off to the side. So we have Myths of the Asanas, the stories at the heart of the yoga tradition. Mudras, yoga in your hands, living your yoga, finding the spiritual in everyday life. And finally, Yoga at Home, inspiration for creating your home practice. Now, these are not the only yoga books that I would recommend. These are just 4 that I picked that I feel can sort of inspire the home yoga practice or elevate the practice right now, especially while we deal with figuring out how to practice yoga during the coronavirus pandemic when we can't go to our home studios and such. So I hope that you check these books out. I hope that they inspire you as much as they have inspired me. If you have other book recommendations, I would love to hear them. You can hit me up on Instagram at Dharma Drops Podcast. Just send me a DM and let me know what books that you love. And we can compile a list together of books that can help inspire and elevate our yoga practice. But outside of that, that is it for today's mini drop episode. You can find all the Dharma Drop shenanigans at dharmadropspodcast.com, and I will see you next time. Cheers, guys. Let's ferment some stuff. Okay, bye, friends.